Today I would like to familiarize you with Pelagius. He was officially deemed a heretic in 418 at the Council of Carthage and again at the Ephesian Council of 431 after his death. However, more recently the doctrines of Pelagius are being re-examined, and perhaps he was more orthodox than originally thought. Here is a general overview of the life and locations of Pelagius. He was born in Roman Britain sometime in the middle of the 4th century. Once grown, he moved to where the action was, in Rome. Before Rome was sacked by the Visigoths in 410, he and many others fled to North Africa. He spent some time in Carthage. At some point, he made his way to Palestine and was there before 415. He faced great pressure there and was condemned in 418 and expelled. It is thought that he went to Egypt for the remainder of his life. We'll now take a look at his life more closely, beginning in Britain. It is thought that Pelagius was born sometime between 354 and 360. Some of his noteworthy contemporaries were Augustine, Jerome, John Chrysostom, and John Cassian, and he lived under the Valentinian and Theodosian dynasties. Pelagius was a Celtic Roman Christian, likely raised in a well-off family. This was shown in the fact that he was able to receive education instead of working manual labor. It was possible that his education was preparing him for a law career, but this is speculative. Pelagius moved on to Rome sometime around 380. Remember, Rome by this time was Christianizing because of Constantine. But when Pelagius was in Rome, he did not do as the Romans did. He was discouraged by the nominally Christian populace, and he strove to set an ascetic example of living. As he taught about the high standards of living he felt the gospel was calling Christians to, he developed a following of people, including women, some aristocratic families, and a man by the name of Pelagius. He started writing while in Rome, commentaries on Paul's epistles, and perhaps his own letters to people and treatises. The Visigoths under Alaric came to sack Rome, and so by 410 Pelagius and many others had fled. Pelagius and Pelagius originally arrived in Hippo, where Augustine was bishop, though they likely never met. The photo on the left is the coast of modern Tunisia, close to where they would have landed. They went on to Carthage, where Pelagius stayed for a short amount of time. It is not known how long, perhaps only a few months. The conflict between Pelagius and Augustine was rising, as Pelagius's ideas were spreading and they stood counter to Augustine's. His follower, Pelagius, came under fire for his doctrines, and in 411 was denied ordination, so he sailed for Ephesus to be ordained there instead. Now let's turn our attention to the main tenets of Pelagius's teaching compared to Augustine's. Though these are generalized, please note that the tenets of Pelagius here are as accurate as I can tell, and they do differ from what he was accused of by his detractors. Also, please note that the way Pelagius thought about these things were not his own invention, but merely echoes of a more Eastern tradition that was already established. On sin, Pelagius believed that people were only responsible for their own sins and the resulting consequences, while Augustine believed that people also inherit Adam's sin, guilt, and a totally corrupted nature. On free will, Pelagius believed that people are given a free will from God. Augustine, however, believed that people's wills are enslaved and not free until God makes them so. Next, Pelagius believed that the grace of God is present both in the gift of a free will and also the power to do good. Augustine believed that God's grace is a pre-requirement for anything good. For Pelagius, salvation comes through putting one's trust in Christ and following the example of his whole life. Augustine believed that salvation is through God's action and election. The human choice has little to do with it. Lastly, regarding good works, as a moralist, Pelagius believed that good works confirm one's redemption as authentic. One cannot simply call oneself a Christian, they must actually behave as one. Augustine believed that any good works done by people are the result of God's grace and not a product of their own nature. Pelagius moved on to Palestine between 411 and 415, which likely seemed a safer place to be. But once there, he began to face opposition from Jerome and others. His teachings began to be known as Pelagianism, and his tenets began to be scrutinized at councils of bishops, which we will now look at. A lot happened in a few short years for Pelagius. The first council was small. It was held in Jerusalem in 415. The main players were Pelagius versus Jerome and Orosius, who was Augustine's pupil. The outcome was undecided. The second council was held at Diospolis, which is 50 kilometers west of Jerusalem. Pelagius was able to defend himself against accusations that his doctrine lacked the necessity of God. He also distanced himself from Caelestius, who likely held similar but differently nuanced doctrine. In his defense, he also showed letters of recommendation. He was acquitted. This angered Augustine, who believed that Pelagius should be considered heterodox. Augustine and company held 2 councils in North Africa where they decided to condemn Pelagius and Caelestius. They then wrote a letter to Pope Innocent I to plead for an official condemnation of Pelagianism. Innocent excommunicated Pelagius, who then sent a letter of defense back to the Pope, but he died before it got there. The succeeding Pope, Zosimus, got the letter instead, and it satisfied the new Pope, who reopened the case. Unfortunately, the African bishops got Emperor Honorius on board with them. He declared Pelagianism heresy, and Pelagius stood condemned. The emperor's decision was ratified at the huge council at Carthage in 418. Pelagian doctrines were condemned as heresies, and Augustine's doctrines were confirmed as orthodox. Under the imperial and ecclesial pressure, Pope Zosimus conformed to the official decision and adopted the party line. He condemned Pelagius also. It is important to note that Pelagius was not present at the Council of Carthage and so could not defend himself. Also, as Zosimus had changed his stance, there was no possibility to appeal to him either. Pelagius stood condemned as a heretic and excommunicated from the official church. After the condemnation decided at Carthage, Pelagius was excommunicated from Palestine and forbidden from going back to Rome. Some speculate that Pelagius returned to Britain, but it is generally accepted that he went to Egypt to live with friends there. There is nothing after 418 that can be confirmed of his life, so he likely died in Egypt. Yet there was one more chapter that was to be written in the story of the councils. In 431, likely after Pelagius' death, a council at Ephesus was called by Theodosius II. There were several issues on the agenda, but it was here that Pope Celestine's written decrees against the Pelagians were again confirmed. The label heretic was now firmly fixed to the man whose name had become synonymous with a set of condemned beliefs. Pelagian's true ideas were kept alive by Julian of Eclanum. He refused to sign the Pope's letter that was circulated to the Eastern bishops for them to sign to avow their alignment with his decision to condemn Pelagius. He and Augustine had a polemic literary battle that raged until 430, where all the old issues were rehashed. He was condemned alongside Nestorius at Ephesus in 431. He and 18 bishops were stripped of their sees and excommunicated. Augustinian doctrine remained the norm for the Middle Ages in the West. But there were pockets of Celtic spirituality that survived, and the Eastern Church did not adopt many of Augustine's beliefs. The Reformation was ironic in a sense, for Luther and his separatists were accusing the Orthodox Church of being Pelagian because they were selling indulgences for forgiveness, a works-based righteousness, which is just what they had accused Pelagius of over 1,000 years before. The Calvinist and Arminian debate can be seen as a loose parallel to the Augustine and Pelagian controversy. Calvin, being committed to Augustinian theories, likely saw Arminius the same threat that Augustine saw in Pelagius, namely, someone who cannot accept their brand of monergism, where God does all the work in the economy of salvation. Calvin, like Augustine, called out his opponents for being monergists to the other extreme, accusing them of believing that people do all the work in the economy of salvation. In a déjà vu moment at the Synod of Dort in 1618 and 19, 15 Arminian leaders and 200 pastors were condemned of heresy, deposed of their pastoral posts, and excommunicated for their deviation from the Church's standardized confessions. It smacks of Carthage in 418. Pelagianism and Arminianism were made to be caricatures of heresy instead of being understood as orthodox doctrines that highlight synergism between God's work and people's. This reputation of Pelagius as a loser and a heretic has been passed down from generation to generation and has been generally accepted uncritically through the centuries, which can still be seen by how he is written about in current devotional and teaching literature. He has somehow become both infamous and invisible. Augustine, on the other hand, is still uncritically championed by many as the superstar of orthodoxy. I think Pelagius and Augustine and their doctrines deserve a more critical and careful examination, which leads me to my final point. Encouragingly, recent scholarship is seeking to defend Pelagius as an Orthodox Christian. Nozomi Yamada has written some excellent articles that dive deep into the culture and writings of Pelagius, and one resource I would highly recommend is the book The Myth of Pelagianism by Alice Bonner, written in 2018. She examines the charges against Pelagius and defends him with his own writings. She also shows how the doctrines he actually espoused were not innovations by him. And finally, she explains how Pelagianism seems to have been a concept that was devised by those who sought to centralize and rigidify orthodoxy. So, was Pelagius a heretic? I believe this charge deserves a re-examination. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be happy to take your questions in Tuesday's Zoom session.